It's my pleasure here to have a discussion with Shigeo Katsu, who's the Regional Vice President for the World Bank for Europe and Central Asia. Shigeo, welcome. So I'd like to begin our dialogue with just a couple of questions about the economy in general. So, and on the World Bank, you have a number of countries, members of the World Bank, and you certainly have a view of the global world in a very unique position. What's your overall comment about where we stand in the global economy?
Well, I guess, of course, the global economy, everybody knows it has been in a tailspin for quite some time. People often refer to pre-Lehman Brothers and post-Lehman Brothers Day in September. But I think the general, recognized evolution of facts is that the financial crisis triggered something that has now turned into a global economic crisis. What we are mostly concerned about now is that the real sector crisis is now sort of also now shifting over into an unemployment crisis, leading possibly to a looming human crisis. And I think this is where institutions such as ours are really concerned about at this point. Yes.
Well, you seem to imply that in some sense this bandwagon of multiple crises is still ongoing at this stage.
I guess so. I mean, though some people, especially since March, April, the market started to show some signs of picking up and all this. But I personally think it's maybe way too early to tell whether indeed we have started to reach the bottom or whether we're just at the phase where we have slowed down the fall, but some more difficulties are ahead. Only time will tell.
What do you think will be the signals, the signs that we have touched the bottom and we perhaps are looking at recovery? Because to some degree you have President Obama himself and some members of the administration today talking about green shoots appearing and some optimism on the future. So what are the signs that we can look for?
I think some of these green shoots are very important. Let's hope that they indeed will grow and not become weeds. And especially for the developed economies, so-called developed economies, where you have a very much developed service and financial services-based economy. And so I think all these market indicators are probably the ones that one has to look out for. But for the developing world, where the markets are much less sophisticated, we are still waiting for, and therefore, for instance, equity markets do not send the same signals or are less relevant. I think we would still look at what are the real economy numbers, the traditional output numbers, export-import numbers, and then, of course, how this translates to the corporate balance sheets and how the employment numbers stack up. All those numbers are the ones that we would certainly look out for. And of course, at a later stage, do we then start to see any signs of stress because of increasing unemployment, that we start to see that there are fewer children, for instance, in school because parents decide to withdraw children from school or are not able to access health services and so on. So
earlier you mentioned, used the phrase human crisis. And I was wondering, is this something you're referring to in particular to the emerging markets and developing world? Clearly in the developed markets also people are losing their jobs and there is a crisis, human crisis for those families who lose their livelihoods. But can you sort of give us a picture in terms of, is the human crisis more severe and more acute, and is the impact of this crisis more acute in the developed emerging markets?
I think one would say that, almost by definition, the poorer countries have less of a cushion let's say, social safety net and others. And yes, you're absolutely right. While in the developed world, in particular, for instance, in the States, one talks about housing foreclosures and people finding themselves without homes, and so it is a human crisis in its own right. But when we talk about the developing world, we talk maybe about another 55, maybe almost up to 100 million people, just this year alone, that find themselves again pushed into extreme poverty. If we talk about, also the emerging economies, poor countries, we think we are probably going to face a situation where maybe more than 1 billion people will find themselves going to bed hungry. those are real human crises. We talk about the situation, you know, the whole world community committed itself to try to shoot for these so-called Millennium Development Goals, halving poverty, or, you know, by 2015, bringing all children to school, sort of improving maternal health, childcare, trying to provide people with access to safe water and so on, and combating these contagious diseases, HIV, AIDS, malaria, and all this. Well, probably all these goals will be much, much more difficult now to reach. And this is where we believe that this crisis, which may be the biggest single crisis that we will see experience in our lifetime, is really going to have a major, major impact on the welfare of our poorer countries.
A lot of the focus has been on America, and probably rightly so, because in some sense the financial crisis emanated from America. But as we know very well, it has moved beyond the shores of America. What's your evaluation of what's happening in your domain of responsibility inside the World Bank in Europe and Central Asia? So how do you see things in these countries?
The countries that I'm responsible for, what we call in the World Bank Group, Europe and Central Asia, cover what typically is referred to as a group of the transition economies, those economies that moved from plan to market about 20 years ago. You know, 20 years ago this fall, we are going to, I guess, all remember the fall of the wall in Berlin in November. And that, I think, sort of set the rails for, I guess, one of the most seminal developments that we probably also will have seen in our lifetime. And the countries came a very long way in a very short time. And not least thanks to the integration with the global marketplace, in particular also the financial integration with the European markets. Most of our countries in Central Eastern Europe, the Baltics, Southeast Europe, but also in the CIS, benefited and grew very fast. They were able to import advanced financial management systems, and so because of the presence of international banks and so. But of course, it also made them extremely vulnerable for any shocks coming in from the outside. Why? Because they were so much dependent on international financial markets. You know, the domestic savings were relatively modest. And in order to fuel this fast growth, in order to fuel this quest for higher sort of consumption levels and so, this was intermediate through the banking system in most cases. And yet it was the same banking system that completely seized up. So yes, our countries were the ones among the emerging markets that were hit hardest and fastest. And after this phase, last year we saw that, in particular starting the last quarter of 2008, growth just simply fell off a cliff. And if you look there also at the first quarter of this year results, you know, industrial production almost in all our countries dropped between 15, 20 to 30%, in some cases even beyond. We are facing pretty dismal economic statistics, but also, you know, start to see all these effects that I mentioned before, hopefully in terms of unemployment and other numbers starting to shoot up. So our country is certainly under stress.
Now, isn't it a bit of irony in the fact that somehow we encourage many of these transition economies to integrate globally and to become more global and to have the systems more integrated, and somehow that is now perhaps coming back to bite them and is affecting them in a very strong fashion. So what's the message for these economies for the future as they look forward? Should they integrate more, or should they have some other strategies that perhaps provide some insulation and buffers from these global tsunamis?
I think in today's world, trying to stay away and be excluded will certainly not help either. I think, as I said, countries did benefit enormously from this integration, from globalization. I guess what we see is that the financial flows and economic flows outstripped the growth of institutions. And institutions, you know, were revealed to be not very robust. And that probably is one of the big lessons that one really needs to focus not just on changing markets and so, but really work on the development of institutions. Going forward, and while it's not going to be a V-shaped recovery, hopefully it's going to be sort of a relatively quick U-shape, but in some countries it's going to maybe be even an L-shaped recovery. I think the wrong message and the wrong lesson to take away would be to turn your back to globalization. I think that's, the welfare of your population actually depends on continuing integration. But you've got to integrate smart, and you've got to create the institutional infrastructure to do so. And that means, better, more solid, market-oriented institutions with proper regulatory framework, oversight, and so on and so on.
No, it's a very important theme you're raising in a sense of smart integration and proper institutions. But where do you learn these best practices from? Because in some sense, America, which was supposed to be the home of these institutions, have somehow shown tremendous and big cracks. And so where do these countries look to for best practices? Do they create them fresh, or do they look for other specific ideas from other countries?
I think learning takes place at all the levels, and I think we certainly live in unusual circumstances in a world full of uncertainties, and where sort of the good practices or best practices, traditional ones, may not necessarily be the ones that countries should aspire to for the future. But learning takes place at all levels. And I think at the macro level, at the public sector, central government levels, some of the fundamentals of what constitutes good economic and financial management really don't change. Over the long run, you cannot simply continue and afford to spend more than you have, than you can mobilize time. But the future will put a premium on efficient and good government, because in a deleveraged world, you have to make your limited resources go further. So I think efficiency concerns are there. But the learning, of course, has to take place at the micro levels, at the sector levels, at the project level, but also at the entrepreneurial level. And this is where, in a way, we would look to institutions such as yours, where indeed global entrepreneurship and leadership and new sort of ideas and what actually is possible, it should be much more researched. And of course, the good examples are not just coming from the traditional advanced economies. I think a lot of the innovation takes place in the emerging markets themselves. And for our countries in particular, there certainly is a message there, and that is, don't only look just west, you have to look in all directions and try to pick up all the good examples that you can.
So learning from everywhere, that's a very important message. Now, you mentioned innovation, and you're here also to inaugurate the Knowledge Economy Forum, which the World Bank is hosting here at INSEAD campus. And I wanted to just touch upon the theme of innovation. How important is innovation for the future success of the countries in your region, especially when you look at history and you look at economies and countries often decreasing their investments in innovation in times of crisis? So what's the role of innovation today for helping us get out of this crisis?
If anything, the role of innovation will be even bigger and more important. Of course, countries are struggling now to cope with the immediate crisis and the urgent things to do, such as stabilize the financial sector, make sure that you provide proper safety nets, and so on. But as we just discussed earlier, one day the crisis will end and there will be a recovery. But for this post-crisis recovery period, it's going to be vitally important that the countries use this period as efficiently as possible and try to even retool themselves. Innovation is part and parcel of this exercise, because whatever form of ownership, and so the globalization and integrated marketplace, global marketplace, will continue. Countries will have to continue to compete, and whoever comes out of these crises as solid as possible and in particular with good entrepreneurship, good innovation systems, will have, I think, a leg up to the competition. So it's going to be vitally important there.
And what is the World Bank doing? It's a very important global institution. And what's the World Bank's current focus in terms of helping countries handle this transition time effectively?
I think we have sort of a multi-pronged approach. First, we try to step up our financial support to the countries. President Zelig, the World Bank president, has already sort of pledged that over these 3 years, the World Bank would basically triple its lending, the pace, annual lending pace. So we are going to lend about 100 billion over 3 years, and that's for the emerging markets. We also try to accelerate our financial support to the poorest countries, the so-called IDA countries, International Development Association, which draws its resources more from direct contribution from the donor community, donor countries. And there, I think we will start to see interesting discussions unfolding as to whether the next replenishment cycle should maybe be advanced or not. So financial support is one. But beyond that, also together with our colleagues from the IFC, International Finance Corporation, which deals with the private sector, we now are looking very much into specific programs. Infrastructure is going to be one element to catalyze employment during this period, difficult period, but also as part of positioning countries for the post-crisis part. We just announced that there will be about 55 billion from the World Bank Group, going to be committed over the next 3 years. We are also going to step up our funding for the social protection part, as we said. We don't want to forget about agriculture and agriculture research as well, given that a large part of the developing world does rely on agriculture. But beyond that, we also will do a lot in terms of trade finance, given that the trade finance has been the one part that's been most affected immediately by the freezing of world finance, in particular through our IFC side. There will be a stepped-up effort there. And we will also do a lot of analytical work.
A lot of our viewers tend to be in the private sector. What kind of recommendations or suggestions would you have for the private sector? What do you expect from them? What should they do?
What sort of has been reported in the press often is that this crisis is actually sort of putting into question the traditional business models of, the state keeping to its role of maybe regulatory and supervising part, but don't interfere with the private sector part. And there is a tendency to think, we talk about nationalization of big banks, of the big financial institutions and so on. There almost is a sense that as if the market-oriented model itself is under pressure and being questioned. And I think the private sector should make sure that, and can do its part, that the wrong lessons are not going to be drawn. I think every crisis also presents an opportunity. And right now is the opportunity for the private sector to really focus on good management, good entrepreneurship. Yes, you may need to seek financial support, not just from the traditional, maybe commercial banks, and I think many governments are ready to provide financial support, but it will not substitute for good management and innovation. So I certainly do look forward for the private sector to be and continue to be the engine of growth.
So looking forward to the post-crisis world, because as you said, whether it's a V or a U or a little bit elongated U, hopefully not L, will come out of the crisis. What are your perceptions about this post-crisis world? What will trigger change? What will drive positive, sustainable growth?
I I think this current acute crisis maybe has temporarily displaced from the public conscience some of the longer-term trends and the longer-term challenges that we all have. One of them is climate change. We know that the whole process and the international effort to try to deal with climate change has to continue. And even though we find ourselves in a crisis, the countries simply cannot turn their back to it. And that means we have to collectively strive to develop models of sustainable growth, in general much more environmentally friendly, low carbon oriented growth, where we are at a relatively early stage. I think theoretically people have maybe, and various regions have started to experiment, but this certainly is one big challenge that countries cannot sort of drop off the radar screen. Climate change, of course, manifests itself in various forms, from energy security, water supply issues, agriculture, food supply, infrastructure, etc., etc. Now, in our region, this is going to be further also overlaid by demographic changes. In particular Europe, but also parts of the former Soviet Union, are rapidly aging societies. Out of the 29, 30 countries in our part of the world, 2/3 will see themselves with a smaller population in about 15 years' time. The impact of that is going to be huge in terms of the cost of aging for society, but also in terms of competitiveness, in terms of the provision of infrastructure, any of these social systems. And that is going to be a longer-term trend. How do you manage that transition is going to be one of the most important challenges for societies. So those are, in my view, some of the things that post-crisis our countries will really have to focus on again.
So it's very important not to lose sort of sight of these bigger challenges that we have, while at the same time making sure that we are able to overcome the current challenges. Absolutely. Thank you very much, Shigeo, for your views and for your thoughts. We wish you and your colleagues at the World Bank all the very best.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor.